We had a first look at some programming basics, functions and types, or some of the important types for the moment. But there is more in programming, and there are two other features which we need to understand before we can go back to our main Dart file. The first feature is the feature or the idea of variables. Thus far, what I always did in here is I always immediately printed the result of add numbers. Of course, this is just some simple dummy code, and therefore this makes sense here. We basically just want to see what this yields us here. In reality, however, you often write programs where you also need to store the result of some calculation or some user input. You want to store it somewhere so that you can use it later. Now, with store, I don't mean in a database, but in memory, because you need it later, a couple of code lines later in the same code. So we don't want to write it into a file or store it in a database. We just want to store it in memory so that when this code executes, we can take it and use it a couple of lines further down, for example. And we can store data with the help of so-called variables. Now let's say that first result here shouldn't be printed immediately, but instead I do want to store it in a variable. You create a variable by giving it any name you want, like first result. And the naming convention here is just the same as for functions. You use camel case, lowercase starting character, then only one word, and every word inside the word starts with a capital character. Now that's first result, and you assign a value to that so-called variable now with an equal sign. Now it's called variable because the data in there is variable. You can change it. Here I'm storing the result of add numbers in first result. I could reuse that and now also store that result in first result. So after the first line, the result of add numbers for 1 and 2.6 would be stored in here. After the second line here, the result of add number with 1 and 1 would be stored here. And the first result, so this result of this line here, would be dropped. We would store that result in the first result variable now. However, we have a syntax error here, and that means that Dart doesn't understand this. This is almost the right syntax, but to tell Dart that this is a variable, you need to add the var keyword here when you create that variable for the first time. So not in this line, where I then use it again, the same variable with the same name, but when you introduce it, then you need to add the var keyword to tell Dart that this is a variable. And now we can, for example, use that result, that first result, whoops, the name is first result, we can use that here in a separate line. Sometimes you even just use a variable to make your code easier to read so that you can split it across multiple lines. Sometimes you have some other code in between that you need to execute first, and then you want to use first result later. Maybe you even want to combine it with some other calculation that you add +1 to it. That would be possible too. First result simply holds the value returned by add numbers. And that number in our case is a double. So you can do anything with it, which you could do with any other double. So now if I run this, we print 3 here because first result has the result of add numbers with 1 and 1 stored, which is 2. And then we add 1 to it. So we have 2 + 1, and we print that result, and therefore see 3 here. Variables are a core feature in Dart, and we'll see it a lot throughout this course. Now, besides that syntax, where I use var for creating it, you can also create it by adding the type of data which this variable will hold eventually. So in this case, we could also write double first result. However, Dart also has a feature called type inference. This means it's able to infer the type of data you'll store here by the value you have on the right side. Here, since I call add numbers, which returns a double, and which always returns a double, Dart is able to infer that first result will hold a double. And therefore, you don't have to tell Dart that this is the case. And actually, it's considered a better practice to then just use var. It would be a different thing if you created the variable like this, without assigning an initial value. That is possible too. The variable now exists, but it is uninitialized. And sometimes this is also something you need to do because you want to create a variable, and at a later point of time, you want to assign different values to it. In such a case, it is a good practice to tell Dart which kind of data will eventually end up in this variable. So then you should use the type here instead of var. In this case, that's a double. If we now run this, we see the same output as before, but now we created this a bit different, and we are using double instead of var here. Now that's one of the important features which I wanted to mention. Another important feature is that Dart is a so-called object-oriented programming language. I did mention that everything in Dart is an object. So this number, this one here, is an object. Now, you would say it's a number, and that's true, but a number is just an object. Now, what is an object? Everything in Dart is basically a data structure with a lot of different information in it. Now, here the information is, of course, that it's 1, but there is some other metadata which Dart uses internally, you could say. Now, why do we actually start expressing our data structure as objects? Well, that is simply related to the real world. If we think about the real world, we work with objects there too, right? You have a car and you can drive that car, or your car has a certain amount of seats or a certain amount of horsepower. So we describe our real world with objects. And the idea simply is to bring that way of thinking into development, into programming, so that it's closer to the real world. So we work with objects in our program because, of course, typically with programs, like here where we're building apps, we also have things which we could describe as objects. For example, in a mobile app, we have a button. A button, of course, would be a valid object if you think about it like this. So that's why we call it object, and where this idea of using objects comes from, why we group things into data structures that we call objects. That simply comes from the real world, and it should help you think about and reason about your program. And the core idea really just is that you can kind of bring the way you think about reality into how you think about your programs. That's the rough general idea. And how you work with objects will, of course, become very clear throughout this course, because we work with objects all the time in there. Now, you can also create your own objects, because sometimes you're not just working with a text or a number, but you have a more complex data structure which you want to express in your code. Let's say you have a person with a name and an age. Of course, we could create a variable here, string name. String, this is how you tell Dart that this will be of type string. Please note that unlike double, it starts with a capital character. That's just how it is. So you could have a string name and let's say a int age. That would be possible, and you could store values in there. And to you as a developer, it would of course be obvious that these two are related. However, for other developers it might not be, and even if it is clear, it's a bit annoying that you always have to, well, work with these two separate variables. It would be nice if you could merge it into one variable. And that can be done with so-called objects. To create an object, you first of all need a blueprint for it that tells Dart how this object should look like. You do this with another core Dart feature, which you also see in other programming languages, which is a class. A class allows you to define a blueprint for, well, objects. A class needs to have a name, and that could be person. And here the naming convention is not to start with a lowercase character, but with an uppercase character. Then you add your class body with curly braces, just as you did it for the function. And still, this is no function, this is a class, it's a different thing. And in between that class, you can now define how that class, and therefore objects based on that class, should look like. Now, what does this mean? Well, for example, you can add variables in here. You can add a variable name and age if you wanted to. So what I basically had down there is now added in that class. And you can also give this default values, just as we did it before. Now, if you have a variable in a class, this is also sometimes called a property. It's still a variable, it's just inside of a class, and therefore we give it that special name, so that when I say we change this property, you know that we changed a variable inside of a class. A variable inside of a function, on the other hand, is called a variable. And we have these different terms, so that when I say property, it's clear I'm referring to a variable in the class and not to a variable in the function. So here we have these two pieces of data now in our class. And it is worth mentioning that just like with normal variables in a function, if you are assigning a value, which I'm doing here with max and 30, then you should actually use var here as well instead of string and int. Now I use string and int here because I'll change this later to not initialize it, but if you would leave it like this, if you plan on initializing a property with, well, an initial value, then you should also use var there instead of repeating the type. Repeating the type won't be an error, but it is considered a better practice to use var and let type inference of Dart do its job. And now down there in the main function, if we need such a person, we can create a variable p1 or whatever you want to name it, and you create a new instance of this class, because the class is just a blueprint. The instance of the class is the concrete object with which you're working, by calling person like this. Now, if you have some other programming experience, you might be used to using the new keyword in front of that. New is required in some other programming languages to create a new object based on your own class. Now, that can be used in Dart too, but since Dart 2, which we use in this course, it's not required anymore, and therefore we just call person like this. So now we have person executed like a function actually, with parentheses here. And this will instantiate this class and store it in P1. And therefore now if I print P1 here and I run this code, you actually see instance of person being printed here. Now on this class, you can now conveniently access the data that's stored in here with the dot notation. So I can type P1 dot, and now I could choose name or age or a couple of other things which every class has in Dart, automatically added by Dart. But here I could print P1H, and if I now run this, we see 30 here. And that's what I meant. Now we grouped that data together, and we can create new persons by simply calling person again. We can also change that data on a person by accessing P2 name and changing that to menu, for example. And now if I would print P2 name down there, and I print P1 name up here, so for the two different persons I print the names, then you see that here on the right we print menu and max, because for the first person I didn't change it, and therefore we have that default. For the second person I did change it, and therefore here where I changed it, we changed it to menu. Down there when I print it, I print menu. This is how that works, and classes are a crucial feature in many programming languages, and they also are in Dart. Now there's more about classes and about Dart, which we'll learn throughout this course. I don't want to bore you now with a 1 hour long introduction to Dart. I find it more interesting to learn Dart whilst we are learning Flutter. But these are some basics which I needed to get out of the way so that we now can continue working on our main Dart file and understand what's going on in there.